Hi everyone, hope you're okay. It seems like an awful long time since I last saw you. So, for my book, I wanted to share with you probably my favourite author of all time. And this is a chap called Terry Pratchett. And he has written loads and loads of novels, some for adults and some for children. And he's also written a few short stories. And it's one of his short stories I'm going to read you now. So this one is called Rincemangle, the Gnome of Even Moor. Once upon a time, there was a gnome who lived in a hollow tree on Even Moor, the strange, mysterious land to the north of Blackberry. His name was Rincemangle, and as far as he knew, he was the only gnome left in the world. He didn't look very gnome-like. He wore a pointed hat, of course, because gnomes do. But apart from that, he wore a shabby mouse-skin suit and a rather smelly overcoat made from old moleskins. He lived on nuts and berries and the remains of picnics, and birds' eggs when he could get them. It wasn't a very joyful life. One day, he was sitting in his hollow tree, gnawing a hazelnut. It was pouring with rain, and the tree leaked. Rincemangle thought he was getting nasty twinges in his joints. "Blow this for a lark," he said. "I'm wet through and I'm fed up." An owl, who lived in the tree next door, heard him and flew over. "You should go out and see the world," he said. "There's more places than Even Moor." And he told him stories about the streets of Blackberry and places even further away, where the sun always shone and the seas were blue. Actually, they weren't very accurate, because the owl had heard them from a blackbird, who heard them from a swallow who went there for his holidays, but they were enough to get Rincemangle feeling very restive. In less time than it takes to tell, he had packed his few possessions in a handkerchief. "I'm off," he cried, "to places where the sun always shines." "How far did you say they were?" Said the owl, who hadn't the faintest idea. "About a couple of miles, I expect. Perhaps a bit more." "Cheerio, then," said Rincemangle. "If you could read, I'd send you a postcard. If I could write one." He scrambled down the tree and set off. When Rincemangle the gnome set off down the road to Blackberry, he really didn't know how far it was. It was raining, and he soon got fed up. After a while, he came to a lay-by. There was a lorry parked there, while the driver ate his lunch, and Rincemangle, who had often watched lorries go past his tree, climbed up a tyre and looked for somewhere warm to sleep under the tarpaulin. The lorry was full of cardboard boxes. He nibbled one and found it was full of horrible tins. They weren't even comfortable to sleep on. But he did eventually drop off, just as the lorry set off again to Blackberry. When Rincemangle woke up, it was very dark in the box, and there was a lot of banging about going on. Then that stopped, and after waiting until all the sounds had died away, he peered cautiously through the hole. The first thing he saw was another gnome. "Hullo," said the gnome. "Is there much interesting in there? It looks like another load of baked beans to me. Here, help me get a tin out." Together they gnawed at the box until one tin rolled out. The box was on a high shelf, but the other gnome had got up by climbing it, rather like a mountaineer. They lowered the tin down on a piece of thread. "My name's Featherhead," said the gnome. "You're new here, aren't you? Just up from the country?" "I thought I was the only gnome in the world," said Rincemangle. "Oh, there's a lot of us here. Who wants to live in a hollow tree when you can live in a department store like this?" Talking and rolling the tin along in front of them, they crept out of the storeroom and set off. The store was closed for the night, of course, but a few lights had been left on. There was a rather nasty moment where they had to hide from the lady who cleaned the floors, but after a long haul up some stairs, Rincemangle arrived at the gnome's house. The gnomes had built themselves a home under the floorboards, between the toy shop and the do-it-yourself department, though they had borrowed quite a lot of railway track from the toy shop and built a sort of underground railway all the way to the restaurant. They even had a telephone rigged up between the colony and the gnomes who lived in the gents' suiting department 2 floors down. All this came as a great shock to Rincemangle, of course. When he arrived with his new friend Featherhead, pushing the baked bean tin in front of them, he felt quite out of place. The gnomes lived in small cardboard houses under the floorboards, with holes drilled through the ceiling to let the light in. Featherhead rolled the tin into his house and shut the door. "Well, this is a cut above the old hollow tree," said Rincemangle, looking around. "Everyone's in the restaurant, I expect," said Featherhead. "There's about 300 gnomes live here, you know. My word, I think it's very odd you living out in all weathers. Most gnomes have lived indoors for years." He led Rincemangle along the floor, through a hole in a brick wall and along a very narrow ledge. It was the lift, he explained. Of course, the gnomes had managed to use the big lift, but they'd rigged up a smaller one at the side of the shaft. It was driven by clockwork. They arrived in the gents' suiting department after a long ride down the dark shaft. It was brightly lit, and several gnomes were working a giant sewing machine. "Good evening," said one, bustling up, rubbing his hands. "Hello, Featherhead, what can I do for you?" "My friend here in the moleskin trousers," began Featherhead. "Can't you make him something natty and tweed? We can't have a gnome who looks like he's just stepped out of a mushroom." The gnomish tailors worked hard. They made Rincemangle a suit out of a square of cloth in a pattern book, and there was enough over for a spare waistcoat. Featherhead laid him back down under the floorboards, and they went on to the toy department, where most of the gnomes spent the night. They slept when the store was open during the day. All the lights were on. 2 gnomes were racing model cars around the display stands. 2 teams of gnomes had unrolled one of those big football games and had started playing, while the crowd squeaked with excitement. "Don't any human beings ever come down here at night?" asked Rincemangle, who was a bit shocked. "I mean, you don't keep lookouts or anything?" "Oh, no. No one comes here after the cleaners have gone home," said Featherhead. "We have the place to ourselves." But they didn't. You see, the store people had noticed how food disappeared and how things had been moved around in the night. They were sensible and didn't believe in gnomes. So they had bought a cat. Rincemangle saw it first. He looked up from the football game and saw a big green eye watching them through the partly open door. He didn't know it was a cat, but it looked like a fox, and he knew what foxes were like. "Run for your lives!" he bellowed. Everyone saw the cat as it pushed open the door. With shrill cries of alarm, several gnomes rolled back the carpet and opened the trap door to their underground homes. But they were too late. The cat trotted in and stared at them. "Stand still now," hissed Rincemangle. "He'll get you if you move." Fortunately, perhaps because of the way he said it, the gnomes stood still. Rincemangle thought quickly and then ran to one of the toy cars the gnomes had been using. As the cat bounded after him, he drove away. He wasn't very good at steering, but managed to drive right out of the toy department before crashing the car into a display. He jumped out and climbed the stem of a potted plant just as the cat dashed up. Rincemangle climbed right up the potted plant just as the cat came scampering towards him. From the topmost leaf, he was able to jump onto a shelf, and he ran and hid behind a stack of china plates, knocking quite a few down in the process, I'm sorry to say. After half an hour or so, the cat got fed up and wandered off, and he was able to climb down. When he got back to the gnome home, under the floorboards, the place was in uproar. Some families were gathering their possessions together, and several noisy meetings were going on. He found Featherhead packing his belongings into an old tea caddy. "Oh, hello," he said. "I say, that was pretty clever of you, leading the cat away like that." "What are you doing?" "Well, we can't stay here now they've got a cat, can we?" said Featherhead. But it was even worse than that, because very soon the night watchman, who usually stayed downstairs, came up and saw all the broken things on the floor, and he called the police. All the next day the gnomes tried to sleep, and when the store emptied for the night, the head gnomes called them all together. They decided that the only thing to do was to leave the store. But where could they go? Rincemangle stood up and said, "Why don't you go back and live in the country? That's where gnomes used to live." They were all shocked. One fat gnome said, "But the food here's so marvellous. There's wild animals in the country, so I've heard tell, that are worse than cats even." "Besides," someone else said, "how would we get there? All 300 of us, it's miles and miles away. Just then, two gnomes burst in, dragging a saucer full of blue powder. It smelt odd. They'd found it in the restaurant. Rincemangle sniffed at it. "It's poison," he said. "They think we're mice. I tell you, if we don't leave soon, we'll all be finished." Featherhead said, "I think he's right. But how can we leave? Think of the roads we'd have to cross, for one thing." As the days passed, things got worse and worse for the gnomes. Apart from the cat, there were night watchmen patrolling the store after everyone had gone home, and the gnomes hardly dared to show themselves. But they couldn't think of a way to leave. None of them fancied walking through the city with all its dangers. There were the lorries that delivered goods every day, but only a few brave gnomes were prepared to be a stowaway on them. And besides, no one knew where they would stop. "We'll have to take so much with us," moaned the head gnome, sitting sadly on an empty cotton reel. "String and cloth and all sorts of things. Food, too. A lot of the younger gnomes wouldn't survive for 5 minutes in the country otherwise. We've had such an easy life here, you see." Rincemangle scratched his head. "I suppose so, but you'll have to give it up sooner or later. Where's Featherhead?" Featherhead, the gnome Rincemangle was staying with, had led a raid on the book section to see if there were any books about living in the country. Towards dawn, a party of tired gnomes came back, dragging a big paper bag. "We were almost spotted by the night watchman," muttered Featherhead. "We got a few books, though." There was one in the sack that had nothing to do with the country. Rincemangle looked at it for a long time. "Teach yourself to drive," he said. He opened it with some difficulty and saw a large picture of the controls of a car. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, the head gnome said, "It's very interesting, but I hardly think you're big enough to drive anything." "No," said Rincemangle, "but perhaps—" "Featherhead, can you show me where the lorries were parked at night? I've got an idea." Early the next evening, the two gnomes reached the large underground car park where the store lorries were parked. The journey had taken them quite a long time because they took turns at dragging the book on driving behind them. And it took them all night to examine the lorry. When they arrived back at the toy department, they were very tired and covered in oil. Rincemangle called the gnomes together. "I think we can leave here and take things with us," he said, "but it will be rather tricky. We'll have to drive a lorry, you see." He drew diagrams to explain. 100 gnomes would turn the steering wheel by pulling on ropes, while 50 would be in charge of the gear lever. Other groups would push the pedals when necessary, and one gnome would hang from the driving mirror and give commands through a megaphone. "It looks quite straightforward," said Rincemangle. "To me it looks as though driving just involves pushing and pulling things at the right time." An elderly gnome got up and said nervously, "I'm not sure about all this. I'm sure there must be more to driving than that." But a lot of the younger gnomes were very enthusiastic, and so the idea took hold. For the rest of the week, the gnomes were very busy. Some stole bits of string from the hardware department, and several times they visited the lorries at night to take measurements and try to find out how it worked. Meanwhile, the older gnomes rolled their possessions down through the store until they were piled up in the ceiling of the lorry garage. A hand-picked party of intrepid mountaineering gnomes found out where the lorry keys were kept, high up on a hook in a little office. Rincemangle, meanwhile, studied road maps and wondered what the highway code was. At last, the day came for moving. "We've got to work fast," said Rincemangle, when they heard the last assistant leave the building. "Come on, now!" While the gnomes lowered their possessions through the garage roof onto the back of the lorry, Rincemangle and an advance party of young gnomes squeezed into the cab through a hole by the brake pedal. Inside it was, to them, like being in a big empty hall. The steering wheel seemed very big and far too high up. The gnomes formed themselves into a gnome pyramid, and by standing on the topmost gnome's back, Rincemangle managed to throw a line over the steering wheel. Soon they had several rope ladders rigged up and could set to work. They planned to steer by 2 ropes tied to the wheel, with 50 gnomes hanging onto each one. While this was being sorted out, other gnomes built a sort of wooden platform up against the windscreen, just big enough for Rincemangle to stand and give orders through a megaphone. other gnomes came in and were sent to their positions by Featherhead. Before long, the cab was festooned with rope ladders, pulleys, and fragile wooden platforms, and these, in turn, were covered with gnomes hanging onto levers and lengths of thread. The big moment came when the ignition key was hauled up and shoved into its keyhole by two muscular gnomes. They gave a twist, and some lights came on. "Right," said Rincemangle, looking down at the waiting crowd. "Well, this is going to be a tricky business, so let's get started right away." Featherhead joined him on the platform and hauled up the Teach Yourself to Drive book and a street map of Blackberry. "On the word go, the starter button party will give it a good press, and the accelerator pedal squad will press the pedal briefly," Rincemangle said uncertainly. "The gnomes working the clutch and gear lever will stand by. Go!" Of course, it didn't work as simply as that. It took quite some time before the gnomes found out how to start up properly, but at last the engine was going, making the cab boom like a gong. "Headlights on! Clutch down! First gear!" Rincemangle shouted above the din. There were several ghastly crashes, and the great lorry rolled forwards. "Here, what about the garage doors?" shouted Featherhead. The lorry rolled onwards. There was a loud bang, and it was out in the street. "Turn left!" shouted Rincemangle hoarsely. "Now straighten up!" For several minutes the cab was full of shouts and bangs as the gnomes pushed and pulled on the controls. The lorry wove from side to side and went up on the pavement several times, but at least it kept going. Rincemangle even felt bold enough to order a gear change. Through the dark streets of Blackberry, the lorry swayed and rumbled, occasionally bouncing off lampposts. Every now and again there was a horrible clonk as it changed gear. Steering was the big difficulty. By the time the gnomes down below heard Rincemangle's order, it was usually too late. It was a good job there were no other vehicles on the road at that time of night, or there would have been a very nasty accident. They blundered through the traffic lights and into Blackberry High Street, knocking a piece off a pillar box. Featherhead was staring into the great big mirror high above them that showed what traffic was behind. "There's a car behind with a big blue flashing light on it," he said conversationally. "Listen, it's making a siren noise." "Very decorative, I'm sure," said Rincemangle, who wasn't really listening. "Look lively down below. It's a straight road out of town now, so change into top gear." There was a thud and a crash, but the gnomes were getting experience now, and the lorry whizzed away, still weaving from side to side. "The car with the flashing lights keep trying to overtake us," said Featherhead. "Gosh, we nearly hit it that time." He craned up and had another look. "There's two human beings in peaked caps inside it," he said. "Gosh, they look furious. I expect someone's got a little angry because of all those lampposts we knocked down. I don't think we were supposed to," said Rincemangle. Unfortunately, while he said this, he didn't look where they were going. The lorry rumbled off the road and straight through a hedge. The field behind it was ploughed, and the gnomes had to hang on tightly as they were jolted around in the cab. The police car screeched to a halt, and the two policemen started running across the field after them, shouting. The lorry went through another hedge and frightened a herd of cows. Rincemangle peered through the window. There was a wood ahead, and behind that the heather-clad slopes of even Moor started climbing up towards the sky. "Prepare to abandon lorry!" he shouted. They plunged into a wood, and the lorry stopped dead in the middle of a bramble thicket. It was suddenly very quiet. Then there was a very busy 5 minutes as the gnomes unloaded their possessions from the back of the lorry. By the time the policeman arrived, there was not a gnome to be seen. Rincemangle and Featherhead were sitting high up on a bramble branch and watched as the men wandered around the abandoned lorry, scratching their heads. After poking around inside the cab and finding the little ropes and ladders, they wandered away, arguing. When they'd gone, the gnomes crept out of their hiding places and gathered around Rincemangle. "Even Moor's only a few hundred yards away," he said. "Let's spend the day hidden here, and we can get up there tonight." The gnomes lit fires and settled down to cook breakfast. Many of them were wondering what it would be like to live in the country again after so long in the town. A lot of the little ones, of course, even littler than the average gnome, were rather looking forward to it. But they all knew that there was going to be a lot of hard work before them. Early next morning, a poacher, coming home for breakfast, told his wife that he'd seen a lot of little lights climbing up the slopes of the moor. She didn't believe him, but perhaps you will. So that's the end of that story. As I say, it's by Terry Pratchett, and it's actually the basis of one of his first children's novels called Truckers. So if you enjoyed that, you might like to read the whole book of Truckers at some point. And that had 2 other sequels as well, one called Diggers and one called Wings. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully it won't be too long before I'm able to read you a story in person. Take care, look after yourselves.